שלום לכולם, ערב טוב. בואו נתיישב, כל מי שעוד מסביב. אמיר, דורון, נדיה, אני רואה אתכם. בואו, שבו. Okay, I will switch to English now because we are also broadcasting this on Facebook via our website. So good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to see so many faces here. Welcome to Layer 2.0. This is our competition of the Liebling Lab. And I want to perhaps take this opportunity to just look around as we're standing on the Liebling roof and see all those crazy extensions on buildings that you see all around us. And I want you to be aware that this is exactly what we're talking about, no? It's so important to see this historic city on one hand, but still understand that this time we're facing right now is really the beginning of a new layer of the city. And as we have been already doing so many building extensions in Tel Aviv, it's also a good time to reflect back, like Amir is going to show us with his work, and Dorit, on what has been done in the city so far, in order to also understand what we can do in the future. So some of our judges are here as well, like Daniel Strasburger, who just asked me before, so what is this competition really all about? And it's really important for me to say that this is an idea competition. It's not about building an extension per se. You don't have to build an extension in the box that you're used to according to the building regulations of the city. You have to really think beyond and really, you know, futurize what you want the new layer of the city to look like. So having said that, let's start with seeing what this competition is all about. So I will have the clicker. Where is it? Can we just go ahead and... Okay, thank you. So, as we said, Tel Aviv is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and I think we're dealing with something very interesting because it's not only about a few buildings in the city, it's really the whole historic heart of the city that is under conservation on one hand and under construction, massive construction on the other. So we would like to use this opportunity to look at Tel Aviv, but also look at a lot of other cities that are facing the same issues of wanting to stay authentic and specific on one hand, on the other hand also the need to extend and adapt to the needs of the society today. And this is why we're launching this international competition here in the historic heart of Tel Aviv. And the idea is really to also talk about issues that we're facing today that we cannot avoid anymore, like, you know, new materials, sustainability, also, of course, agendas that are society-based, like gentrification, and all of those issues that we're facing when we plan tabula rasa are, of course, also so important to do in the heart of the city as it is already built, and we don't want to interfere with it too much. So what does it really mean? So Layer 2.0 is an idea competition. It means that you can build 2.5 floors like you usually could in the heart of the city, but you're not obliged to see any other example in order to compare it to your idea, or you're not obliged to obey any building regulation laws. And the idea is really that we have the municipality with us. We are part of the municipality. We're part of the planning department of Tel Aviv, and we're part of the conservation department, which is with us today, Jeremy and Orit, which you will get to know pretty soon. And this whole competition is about a dialogue with the regulators to see the building addition not only from the view of the planner, but also from the view of the regulator, in order to really face this concept that we're dealing with. So let's look at the competition website. Shell, maybe you want to go over it? Do you feel like it? So Shell is our laboratory head here. So, I don't know. Let's try. No. Okay, let's try it on the. So anyway, all the information that you need is on our Liebling website, and we have a specific website for the competition as well. In the website itself, you can see all the information you need, from how much it costs to register, a link to the registration. You can see all the buildings. You can have all the information on the buildings, like a little building book, and also the plans in DWG for you to start working on. You can see the terms of conditions, as well as the judges, which are going to also be in interaction with you in the later part. It is important to say that the competition is anonymous, and you must submit according to a specific format that we're dealing with. Let's see if we can click on the website. I guess not, so let's just skip it. We can do it without it. Yes, please.
I just want to say that also on the website you can find all of the events that are planned. We have a lecture series to help kind of enrich your knowledge of the city and all of the other issues and challenges that Tel Aviv specifically is dealing with. And also you can find contact details for any sort of question that may arise.
Yes, so it's important to say that if you have a question, then there's a lab mail, and Shell is here to answer your questions. We are talking about these issues that we mentioned before: society and community, sustainability and innovation, basically. But we really don't want you to only think in these terms. Please be free enough to investigate and research yourself what is interesting for you in this project and in the city at large, and focus on that. And it is important to say also that there is a big media coverage ahead of us. So we will be online, and we also be featured in many channels, which hopefully is very important in order to create a dialogue about the future of the city, not only with the municipality, but also internationally. There is an exhibition in the end, so chosen projects, around 100, will be displayed in the Liebling House in an exhibition. This is the place to say that we also encourage you to send a 3D model. The 3D model is going to be photographed by you in the beginning, and if you're chosen as one of the 100 projects that go in the exhibition, then you'll be asked to send the model to us at the Liebling House. And these are the lectures that Shell has mentioned. We have a tour coming up tomorrow in Tel Aviv, which Adi from the municipality is going to head, and a day after, on Tuesday, a tour in Jaffa, and the buildings in Jaffa that Rinat is going to head. And those are some of the lectures that we're going to face: construction techniques, materials, local planning principles, and. So the submission requirements are very strict because we're doing an exhibition. So you'll be asked to send everything online, and it's going to have a strict format. You have to explain what your idea is all about in writing, but you will also have to submit those plans which we can also talk about later more in detail. But the idea is to really send all the material that supports your idea from the macro to the micro, and everything that you think might help the judges understand what is important for you. So I think this is the time to also go ahead and talk about Tel Aviv more closely, and it is also very important for us to show what has been done here in the city with Jeremy Hoffman, the head of the conservation department, for the local people, but also for the international audience that might have not seen Tel Aviv so far. I think Tel Aviv is a very much a laboratory of this 2.0 idea anyway. And of course the tours will also be filmed tomorrow for the audience that is abroad, in order to see as much as we can the buildings on site without being there really. So please, Jeremy, we'll head it over to you.
Good evening, everyone, wherever you are around the globe. Thank you very much, Sharon, for this clear introduction. Thank you very much, the Liebling House, for this huge and amazing project. We're really thrilled to see the results. Some words regarding the history of Tel Aviv, a very short one. I would like to raise two major points regarding the basic ideas that were the generation of the city. So the modern city of Tel Aviv was created in 1925. It was the moment of the emergence of and the approval of the plan, the urban plan of Patrick Guedes. You can see the plan here on the right side. The basic idea of the plan is creating urban blocks, parcels, and it's one of the only plans, modern plans, that were approved and conserved at their original state until today. It's one of the reasons the White City of Tel Aviv was declared as World Heritage in 2003. I would like to claim two points regarding modernity. The first would be that Guedes, the planner, his basic idea was not about modernism, not about architecture, it was about health. The need to create a new city that will be a healthy city. In his report, he wrote a lot about the need to reduce death of children and creating a new society that will have better conditions in the city. So the first term on which I will refer is health, or sustainability in a general broader way to see the issue. The second point you can see on the right side is the idea of the evolution of the city. The idea of a plan was not created to be implemented as it was designed, but to understand the need of the city to be in a constant process of change and adaptation to the different needs of society and people. So you can see on the right side the fact that originally Tel Aviv was born in the city of Jaffa, which is 3,000 or 4,000 years old, and the evolution, the growth of the city to the north was part of the implementation of the different needs of different societies throughout the time, mainly on the 20th century. Now, the modern style, or as we call it in Tel Aviv, the Bauhaus style, the early modernism, became what is the most famous part, visual part of the city. But as I claimed that it was about adaptation, this architecture was originated from Europe, was adapted here in the Mediterranean to the local needs of climate and culture. You can see the balconies, you can see all the different pergolas and lighting systems, and all big range of solutions that were made specifically here in Tel Aviv to adapt to the needs of the new society of the city. So you can speak about the qualities of this architecture. We have 5,000 modern buildings in Tel Aviv and some in Jaffa also, which is maybe the biggest collection of modern, early modernism in the world. But keep in mind that the reason it was designed that way, the first reason was this need for adaptation for the local society. Now I will jump forward to the conservation plan of the city. Is plan number 2650B, if you look on Google. But the basic idea of the conservation plan of the White City of Tel Aviv was the fact that 200 best buildings, best design were aimed for full conservation, to keep them at their original state or bring them back to their original design. And all the rest of them, which are around 900, and there are a lot of other conservation plans, were aimed to grow, to have the ability to adapt again to the specific growing needs of a city that has to be bigger. So the idea of the addition, which is the main part of this content, is aimed to be at the roof, sometimes under the building. The ability to live in cellars it was an evolution 10 years ago in Tel Aviv. But this is the core, the main ideas of the competition. Now these two terms, sustainability and adaptation to the needs of people, were part of two documents that were published at the last years by UNESCO and by UN Habitat Organization worldwide. So I will give a reference to both of them. The first one is the SDG 11, which I suppose everybody knows the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. But specifically, SDG 11 is about culture. And the idea of conservation is about the need to create and sustain culture as a part of the city. So this paper was adopted at Quito. And the second one, which was adopted by World Heritage Center in 2011, is called the HUL, the Historical Urban Landscape Approach. Now, the idea of this new approach for conservation is recognizing the fact that a city is in process of evolution, and the city needs to be consequently adapted to the needs of people and society. So the result is that conservation, of course, it's a contradiction between the will to keep the history of the city or the original state of buildings, and on the other hand, to adapt always the city to the needs of the people. So these two papers should be in front of you, should be understood, and could be, it's a possibility, a part of your ideas about how to adapt the city to the current needs, specifically in Tel Aviv. So as I said, in SDG 11, you have the idea of inclusiveness, of safety, resilience, and sustainability. These 4 points, you can find them in SDG 11 paper. And on the other hand, the HUL, you can find the paper for Israelis. You can find also the Hebrew version in the Liebling site, is about controlling development of surroundings of historical buildings. What you can see on the background is the shore, the Sea of Tel Aviv. Again, one of the qualities of the city which have to be adapted to the White City, which is the central area of conservation. So the result as you can see, for those who know Tel Aviv, is the ability to add floors, to add constructions on historical buildings above and even underground in order to extend the surface of the houses and adapt them. The second point is the ability to create and understand the new layers of the city. So now we talk about the post-independence era, or the modernism, the late modernism, or you can call it the post-war modernism or the brutalism, becomes a new layer of the city which we try to understand today and conserve today. Then we have another layer, which is the postmodernism, the post-socialism, another layer which we have to understand today. What were the qualities of society that build it, and how can we implement them as a part of conservation of the city? And last and not least, I chose one of these postmodern projects just to show that the questions of additions on the floor created sometimes very creative projects that might inspire you. This is a project by Israeli architect Zvi Harel, and it could be maybe a good example or an inspiring project for you guys. So good luck, and have a great time redesigning Tel Aviv. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Jeremy. Now I would like to ask Orit to come and speak to us. The idea is really that we did this competition based on research which was headed by the Conservation Department by Orit. So she will tell us a little bit more about it. Please.
Hi. First of all, I would like to thank the Liebling House for having us here tonight and for making dreams come true. There. No. Yes, okay. Okay, so since the 80s, 2,300 buildings were listed for conservation in different plans and conservation levels. According to these definitions, the majority of these buildings are able to receive additions floor on the rooftops and in the back of the court. Since the 90s until today, hundreds additions were built. Tel Aviv Jaffa is a unique phenomenon in the world, and being a live laboratory for this phenomenon as a historic urban tissue. After 30 years of practice and hundreds of different experiments, it has become the right time to observe and analyze the different approaches in order to understand the different implications on the object itself, the surrounding area, and the whole city, which will help us create new tools and guidelines for future editions. It seems for years that the city was ashamed of its appearance. The center of the city had lost its identity, and negative migration was noted until the 90s, when the negative trend stopped and changed its direction due to Lev Ha'ir and other plans that offered opportunities for the city to grow and renovate. In 2003, after the UNESCO declaration, and later on with the implement of the Conservation Plan 2650B, the city recognized its own identity, definition, character, and the White City phrase got to be a part of the local language. Finally, the city learned to love itself and raised her head proudly. The city is changing, evolving from a historic city built from square cubes to a city made of rectangles and tubes. On our daily work, we touch the conflict of old and new, conservation and renovation, and the conflict between different urban and cultural values when there is no right or wrong answers. It is our responsibility to keep asking questions about the urban proportions, the architectural language, and the different perspective and urban point of view. We need to watch out from passing fades and problematic materials, hard to maintain and not suitable for the local environmental conditions. The answers for this question will create the new DNA of the city. We have to keep in mind that cities are made of layers and we're only part of the story of the city. A city cannot be built in one period and freeze. Thinking about a city as a museum will be a mistake, and balance must be, sorry. Excuse me. And balance must be found. Cities can be I lost it. Okay, I'll make it short. Cities can be hybridic, can get different approaches. It is a living tissue and has got its own rhythm. I'm not giving up yet. One of the main goals of our research was to understand and define the cultural significance of adding a new layer to a historic building as an implement of the city evolution. We should examine the addition as an open dialogue between the original architect of the historic building and his ideas that represent a specific era and architectural style with the architect of the new edition. A pause. This dialogue between the different generations allows us to learn about the different values and what this interaction can teach us about our culture and its approach to toward our own past. This works. I was supposed to do that before and that again. This work gives us a wide perspective of what has been done and create a new toolbox based on the knowledge and the experience of the past. This toolbox will create a better connection between the ideas and their physical expression and create a deeper and more accurate discourse between the planning department, the conservation department, permits department, and the planners. I would like to thank the conservation department for the work, and of course Amir Peleg for the super intelligent research. Amir, save me.
Thank you, Orit. My name is Amir Peleg. I'm an architect. I have a firm together with my partner and wife, Adi Gal, called Gal Peleg Architects, where we design these sort of additions to buildings. I also teach in the Tel Aviv University, and my students are participating in this competition. So a few years ago, when Orit contacted me and asked that I do this survey, which concerns 25 years, the first 25 years of adding building additions to listed buildings in Tel Aviv. So after 25 years, the municipality thought, well, let's think and see what was done in these 25 years, and let's look back and try to learn from it. Let's learn from the good things, from the bad things, and think forward of how we want to go forward from here, from this point. So we thought about a name for the project. We had lots of different names, and then Adi, my partner, came out with this name, Layer 2, and we thought it was very appropriate because Tel Aviv, not like many other cities which maybe people who were doing the competition come from, Tel Aviv is very young compared to other cities. Tel Aviv is barely 100 and a few years old. So we have the opportunity here since the 90s to add a second addition to the city and have a direct dialogue with the people who build these buildings and who build the city and say something about their values and their values in comparison to our values today. So I want to tell you a little bit about Tel Aviv and about how we saw Tel Aviv in this project, and a little bit of how what you see on the outside isn't exactly what we see from the inside. So these are the numbers which you saw in Orit's presentation. We have more or less 2,300 listed buildings in Tel Aviv, which is a lot. From different plans, and most of these buildings, you see about half of these buildings are modern movement buildings. Okay. And if you see these maps of the UNESCO heritage site, the gray area and the yellow area around it, we're not speaking about a single building or single buildings, we're speaking about almost all of the center of Tel Aviv. So when we speak in Israel and in Tel Aviv about preservation and addition, we're not speaking about a single building, but we're speaking of a movement on a much larger scale, and we have to think about it in that proportion. And how do we look at these buildings which we're adding on? So these buildings are very peculiar because on the outside, they look very similar to buildings which we know from other places in the world, especially from Europe. They look very similar formally, and we can make the mistake and try to judge them as we do the original buildings which we saw in Europe from Le Corbusier or Sharon or Mies van der Rohe. But there is a very inherent difference. And Marina Weissman, which was a theorist in Argentina in the 70s, she spoke about how you have to study local architecture in relation to architecture in the place where it was conceived. And she said that unless you understand the reasons for which the local architecture was affected by the original architecture, you won't judge it rightly, and you always see it as a sort of second-hand imitation of the original architecture. And if you want to understand its cultural significance, you always have to ask different questions than the questions asked when you study the architecture in its original place. So if we see here these two images, they both involve modern architecture and camels. But the first one is Nazi propaganda against the Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart in the 30s, where they tried to depict the modern architecture as very primitive, and that's why they made this photomontage and put camels and Arabs near the buildings. But at the same time, we see very similar buildings and very similar camels in Tel Aviv, but this was the reality here. So we see that looks can deceive, and the buildings which look very similar, and of course the camels which are similar, portray a very different story. So when we look at architecture in Tel Aviv and try to understand its meaning, we have to understand the story behind it and its cultural significance in order to connect to its story and to the original architects. And when we want to relate our values today to their values 70 or 80 years ago, it's important to understand where this architecture came from. If we see the architecture preceding the modern movement architecture, the architecture of the 20s in Tel Aviv, we see that it simply was an imitation of the architecture of the places where the architects came from, which were mainly in Central and Eastern Europe. So we see on top photo postcards from Lvov, from Odessa, And we see on the bottom buildings in Tel Aviv, which were almost exact imitations, which were part of what the immigrants brought with them in their suitcases that made them feel at home in Tel Aviv. So they took the original architecture, made it a little smaller in scale, and this is what they built in Tel Aviv. In contrast, the modern movement architecture had a different story. We see on top this sketch that Mendelssohn made for the Schocken department store in Stuttgart. We see his lines and his dynamic style portray the culture of Germany in the 20s, which was maybe the most advanced culture in the world at that time, at least in terms of technology, and we see the architecture as a portrayal, a direct portrayal of the culture. And when we look at the bottom, we see shapes and forms and typology, which is very similar to Mendelssohn's architecture. But this was a place which was very in its beginning technologically. There were lots of sands here, and all these buildings which look like the buildings which portrayed the high-end technology of that time were built in a place which was only made its starting steps. So really, more than portraying progress, they were portraying an image of progress. They weren't portraying where we are, but where we want to be. It's like a train which doesn't have carriages yet, but knows where it wants to go. So when you build a building at the corner of two streets, which you have no buildings in the streets, but the corner is a very beautiful, big, round corner, you say, I know where I want to go, but I'm not there yet. So when we see these similar shapes, we have to understand the difference in the story between the original buildings and the buildings that were built in Palestine. And Mendelssohn, when he saw these imitations in Palestine, wasn't very happy with what he saw. We also have to understand where we are here. When I gave a similar type of lecture 2 years ago, 2 floors on the bottom of this building to master degree architects from all places in the world, one of the reactions to the additions of Tel Aviv, one architect said, "Wow, you're very bold." And it sort of hit me. I didn't know what to do with it, but it made me think a lot. And then when I did this project for the municipality, I understood that, yeah, we're bold. You know, it's very hot here. We're in the Middle East. We speak loudly. We shout. We're very direct. We're not very polite. But this is where we are. This is who we are. So when you see our architecture, this is not Scandinavian architecture. It's not Spanish architecture. We're not German. We're in the Middle East. We're near the desert, and that's how we live, and that's how we act, and that's our architecture. So it's important to understand that when you look at what we do here. So, okay. And another point that is important to understand, that this whole phenomena of preservation and conservation and looking to our past is also a very new phenomena here in Israel. Ben Gurion, which was the first prime minister of Israel, he was the first person who got an honorary degree from the Technion because he was the architecture of the state. And his belief was a building is important because it exists, not because it has any kind of architectural values. And his vision was always looking forward. He looked back, but to the Bible times. He didn't look back 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. And we see an example of this way of thinking when in 1960, not so long ago, the first school of Tel Aviv, which is the first Jewish Hebrew city in Israel, the first school which stood at the end of the first main street, which it doesn't get more symbolic than that, was destroyed in order to build this first skyscraper in Tel Aviv. So we see that there was no nostalgia, no looking back at the past. We don't have a past, we're all the time looking forward. So when all this phenomena of conservation and listed buildings began in the 80s and 90s, it was very new for us. It was a totally new concept in Israel, and people since then have had a sort of hard time in understanding it and relating to it. And maybe now, after 20, 25 years of this process, people are now more accustomed and more used to seeing buildings and the way we treat them and the way we add them, and the importance of having a layer in the city which doesn't change and which is protected from constant changes. But this is, for us, a very new phenomena compared to other places in the world. So when we did this study of the buildings in Tel Aviv, we used a scale conceived by Professor Stephen Sims in his book, which puts all the additions on a scale which lies between distinction on one end and compatibility on the other end. So one end speaks about additions which in a clear way distinct themselves from the original building. It's very easy to say what's original and what's new. And the other ones are, when on the other end of the scale, we have literal replication, which says we take the original building and replicate it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. We don't have any identity of ourselves. We just replicate the original idea. In the middle, we have the more interesting, maybe, types of intervention. The one is invention within a style. It says we have a very gentle way of adding additions to the building which relate strongly to the original style, but have small differences which we can read and understand that these additions aren't part of the original buildings. And then we have abstract references, which maybe is the most difficult one to do, which is where we take the original buildings, try to relate to its ideas and its forms, and try to have an interpretation of these ideas and forms in a new way that relates to them but doesn't imitate them, but also doesn't cut off strongly from them. So this is the scale we had when we studied around 40 test cases, which I won't show today, but what I find more interesting is we found general phenomena which relate to the type of relationships the building additions have with the original buildings. And I think in terms of the competition, maybe this is the most important thing. How we today, with the values we have today, 70 or 80 years after the buildings were built, relate to the original buildings in their form and in the values which they represented. So some of these ideas I'll talk about now. The first idea, which is a simple idea, which is an ending, a suffix, a point at the end of the sentence to the building. We see different types of endings which architects put on the buildings. Sometimes they have a completely different form, but relate to the symmetry of the building and its general shape and give it an ending which it didn't have in the original. Sometimes they use buildings which had singular parts and form a general part, like in this building on the top left, which end the building in a way which relates to it but gives it an ending. Sometimes we have interpretation. We have the original building, and then the addition interprets the original style of the building or original elements or original typology, like the building on the bottom right, where we see the typology of the building continuing in the recessed addition, but in completely different forms and completely different typology. But we see the recessed part in the middle with the 2 parts on the side, continuing in the addition in completely different forms. Growth, we see different types of growth from the original to the new additions. We can see on the building on the left, we see how the 3 original floors gradually change floor by floor from the first addition, floor of the addition to the second to the third. So we have a building that grows and changes from the bottom to the top. We have what we call assemblage, which are more complex ideas where we can't necessarily understand and say what is the original building and what is the addition. They both mingle and one inside the other, and we have a line which isn't easy to trace between the addition and the original buildings, which maybe show us that the architects that designed these additions felt very comfortable working with the original buildings. They didn't feel alienated to them. They felt very comfortable with them, and they felt comfortable to work with them. Not only work on top of them, but work with them, and they felt very comfortable with the values of the original architect which built the buildings. We have replication, which is simple replication. We spoke about that in the scale, where we have original floors which are simply replicated with small differences or without small differences in them. We have separation, which is buildings with that was very important for the architect to show that he is different from the original building. We can easily identify what part of the building is original and what is new, and the architect also chose to separate them with space between them in order to make it very distinct what is original and what is new. And this also, we can read between the lines and understand something about the architecture's relationship to the original building and its values. And if he does connect to these values or doesn't connect to these values, this is part of what he's trying to tell us in his addition. We have these buildings which we call dialogue, which have continued the original building on its original plane without any recessed parts. And this is a very direct dialogue between the new and the old. We see on the building on the right, we see the building continuing but changing different material. But we see the relationship between the original balconies and the new balconies. We see also that the railings of the new balconies also came to visit in the old building. So the relationship isn't only from bottom to top, it also goes from top straight back to the bottom. We have these relationships which we called echo, where we have a relationship between, a formal relationship between a mass and and the surface, yeah. So we see these in all the buildings, which on top they have a sort of echo of the original mass, which resonates the original mass, but in a different way. We have buildings where the top is, the addition is very different from the bottom, but it is in a material way which makes it sort of a background to the original architecture, which stays in front. And we have additions which deal with order, which relate to the original order of the building. We see these in these buildings, which, although the additions are different than the original building, they relate to it in its order. We have some additions which treat the original building as a podium and build the recessed addition in a completely different way than the original building, and the original building becomes a sort of podium for the addition. And we have additions which we can call them resistance or alienation, which try to tell us that maybe they didn't connect to the original idea of the original building and try to show us something different in relation to it. Thank you, and I hope you have a lot of fun doing this competition.
Yes, thank you, Amir, for this wonderful research you've done. Here we are finishing our event today, but I want to still use this few minutes that we still have to introduce this very interesting judging assemblage we have here. They're both from Germany and from Israel. I want to just tell you who they are. So we have architect Louisa Hutton. From Germany, we have Professor Guido Speers, the founding director of the Bundesstiftung Bauakademie in Germany. We have architect Ganit Maislis-Kassif, an architect from Israel. We have the city engineer Udi Karmeli. We have architect Jürgen Meyer-Ha from Germany. And we have architect Daniel Strasburger, who is here with us today. Professor Ralf Niederwagel, who is the vice president of the Federal Chamber of German Architects. Jeremy, who also you've just seen now, the head of the conservation department, and myself. And we are going to judge this competition in February. So until then, please take your time and view those buildings which we have chose for you. You can choose between 5 buildings in Tel Aviv and Jaffa. And this is also the point to thank the municipality of Tel Aviv for supporting this project, and also the interior building ministry of the federal government of Germany in supporting this project, and also the Architects Chamber of Israel. So I hope you will all join us for this interesting dialogue of the futures of our cities, and we'll hope to see you again in our next panel, which is going to be next week on Monday. So thank you very much and have a good evening. Bye-bye.